she introduced herself as his girlfriend. I said, well, hi, girlfriend. Because
here to confront your husband's mistress, Keasia is not his biological daughter.
Your Honor.
The child is in fact your husband's. Your marriage is over. You have no doubt your child is her husband's daughter. You claim he had sex with you, made a baby, and now she needs to deal with the truth.
And to end our conversation, I told him, I feel as though there's something going on that you hadn't told me. And the defendant pops up in the car like she's Ricky Raccoon or somebody, Your Honor. Upon hearing my voice, I'm his wife. Like, at that point, your role is kind of insignificant. Like, I'm his wife, nice to meet you. She started to tell me about how they were intimate, how she lived with him at the hotel that he was presently staying at. She told me she was 3 weeks pregnant. This was November 25th. Well, if I see a wedding band on a man's finger, then I ain't gonna continue to talk to him. It ain't no...
This courtroom description follows a deeply emotional and legally complex paternity and divorce-related dispute overseen by Judge Lauren Lake, where multiple adults arrive seeking one thing above all else: certainty. The case unfolds at the evidence stage in a divorce case, but it quickly becomes much more than paperwork or procedure. It becomes a real-life example of how truth changes everything, echoing the themes often discussed in platforms like the Truth Changes Everything podcast and the Game Changing Attorney podcast. What begins as a question of biological parentage grows into a wider examination of trust, responsibility, and the relationship between law and justice. At the center of the courtroom are three key parties: a legally married wife, a mistress who has recently given birth, and the husband whose actions have tied both women into the same legal crisis. Judge Lauren Lake carefully controls the courtroom, ensuring that emotions do not overpower facts, while also making it clear that morality, though not always legislated, still matters in the pursuit of justice. The wife enters the courtroom determined to confront both her husband and his mistress, stating clearly that if DNA confirms her husband fathered the child, her marriage will end. Her presence reflects countless stories seen in DNA test cheating stories, where certainty becomes the final line between reconciliation and separation. The mistress, equally firm, appears confident that the child is the husband's. She explains her belief through timelines, intimacy, and what she considers undeniable circumstances. Her testimony highlights a common theme discussed in DNA test people regret taking, because while she demands the truth, she also risks life-altering consequences once that truth is revealed. The husband, waiting outside before being called in, represents the silent center of the storm, a man whose lack of honesty has triggered legal, emotional, and financial consequences. As Judge Lauren Lake brings the husband into the courtroom, the narrative shifts from accusation to accountability. He admits under questioning that he concealed his marriage from the mistress, a revelation that reframes earlier testimony and reinforces a critical legal principle: anything less than the whole truth can become a lie. This moment ties directly into the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where intent, omission, and responsibility all matter, even when the law focuses on evidence rather than morality. The courtroom discussion moves into financial responsibility, legal acknowledgement, and the significance of signing a birth certificate. The husband admits he signed the document, effectively accepting legal paternity. This raises the issue of adverse inference in Evidence Act, as Judge Lauren Lake explains how actions taken outside the courtroom can carry legal weight inside it. The wife questions why benefits were claimed, why support has not been paid, and how a child can be legally acknowledged yet emotionally disputed. These questions mirror debates often raised in Supreme Court child support discussions, where legal duty and personal denial collide. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Lauren Lake repeatedly redirects focus toward the child, emphasizing that adult conflict must not overshadow an innocent life. This judicial approach reflects themes found in adoption stories' full episodes, where courts often intervene to protect children from the fallout of adult decisions. The judge makes it clear that regardless of romantic betrayal, the court's responsibility is to determine truth and ensure the child's future stability. When DNA testing is ordered, the courtroom atmosphere changes. The parties confront the possibility that everything they believe may be wrong. The wife hopes the results will free her from uncertainty. The mistress believes they will confirm her claims. The husband stands caught between consequences and relief. This moment captures why DNA test people regret taking has become such a powerful phrase, because once science speaks, there is no appeal to emotion. The DNA results reveal that the husband is not the biological father. The announcement brings shock, relief, and confusion all at once. The wife is vindicated biologically, but left emotionally scarred. The mistress is forced to confront the reality that the man she relied on for certainty is not the child's father. Judge Lauren Lake addresses the outcome with a firm but compassionate tone, reinforcing that DNA does not erase responsibility for past actions, but it does clarify the future. Rather than ending there, the courtroom proceeds into another related case, expanding the discussion of paternity into a broader pattern of mistrust within marriage. A second couple appears, connected by prior infidelity and doubt. This segment highlights how unresolved betrayal can poison even moments of joy, such as holding a newborn child. The husband admits that instead of bonding with his baby, he finds himself analyzing features, a painful reality often discussed in celebrate recovery testimonies, where emotional healing lags behind forgiveness. This second case further illustrates how DNA testing, while scientific, carries emotional consequences. The court hears testimony from family members, examines timelines, and evaluates credibility. Judge Lauren Lake once again emphasizes evidence over speculation, guiding the courtroom through structured reasoning rather than emotional reaction. When DNA results confirm that the husband is not the father, the devastation is immediate and irreversible. The marriage stands at a crossroads, demonstrating how truth can both free and destroy. Across both cases, the courtroom becomes a living example of the relationship between law and justice. The law provides procedures, evidence standards, and outcomes. Justice, however, demands accountability, reflection, and sometimes acceptance of painful realities. Judge Lauren Lake consistently reminds all parties that while the court can determine paternity, it cannot repair trust or undo choices. The description concludes with a powerful reminder that these cases are not just entertainment or isolated incidents. They represent real consequences faced by real families, echoing lessons taught in the Divorce Course podcast and legal education platforms alike. The courtroom does not celebrate chaos, it exposes it. It does not punish emotion, it demands truth. And above all, it underscores that when DNA speaks, silence follows, because science leaves no room for denial. In the end, this courtroom story is not about winning or losing. It is about facing reality, accepting responsibility, and understanding that truth, once revealed, permanently changes everything. As the proceedings continue, the courtroom under Judge Lauren Lake becomes a sustained examination of how unresolved betrayal multiplies into layered legal conflicts. What separates this description from a simple paternity dispute is how clearly it illustrates that DNA testing is never just about biology. It is about credibility, intention, and the long shadow cast by past decisions. The court is no longer only weighing who fathered a child, but how adults repeatedly ignore consequences until the justice system is forced to intervene. Judge Lauren Lake reframes the narrative by explaining that the evidence stage in a divorce case is not designed to punish emotion, but to establish facts that courts can rely on. She highlights that relationships may survive dishonesty, but legal systems cannot function without truth. This framing aligns directly with discussions often raised in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where attorneys emphasize that credibility is currency in court, and once it is spent, it cannot be reclaimed. The wife's role evolves during this stage of the description. Initially appearing as an accuser, she becomes a witness to her own marriage's unraveling. Her testimony no longer centers solely on betrayal, but on confusion, how benefits were claimed, how legal acknowledgement occurred, and how she was forced into a situation where another woman's child was legally connected to her household. This reflects broader conversations seen in Supreme Court child support analyses, where responsibility can be imposed by paperwork even when emotional bonds are absent. The mistress, now confronted with DNA results, experiences a shift from confidence to vulnerability. Judge Lauren Lake addresses her directly, explaining that while the court empathizes with her position, biology cannot be negotiated. This moment mirrors many DNA test people regret taking scenarios, where individuals pursue testing expecting validation, but instead receive destabilizing answers. The court stresses that regret does not invalidate results, and denial cannot rewrite scientific evidence. Attention then turns back to the husband, whose silence becomes its own form of testimony. Judge Lauren Lake explains that failure to speak clearly, both in relationships and in court, often leads to adverse outcomes. She references principles similar to adverse inference in Evidence Act, making it clear that when parties avoid transparency, courts are allowed to interpret actions unfavorably. Signing documents, accepting benefits, and delaying truth all carry legal meaning. The courtroom atmosphere shifts again as the judge broadens the discussion beyond individual blame. She addresses how patterns of infidelity, secrecy, and emotional irresponsibility repeatedly lead families into courtrooms. This reflection connects to themes found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where healing begins only after full accountability is taken. Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that courts are often the last stop after private attempts at resolution fail. As the description progresses, the second case deepens the narrative complexity. Here, prior cheating has already been admitted, and the courtroom is no longer debating whether betrayal occurred, but whether its consequences can ever be fully contained. The husband's testimony reveals how doubt corrodes daily life, how holding a child becomes an exercise in suspicion rather than affection. This emotional detail reinforces why Truth Changes Everything podcast discussions often highlight that uncertainty is more damaging than painful certainty. Family members entering the courtroom expand the scope of impact. Their presence demonstrates that paternity disputes rarely remain private. They ripple outward, affecting extended families and social structures. Judge Lauren Lake carefully manages these testimonies, reminding everyone that speculation cannot substitute for evidence. This reinforces the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where personal belief must yield to verifiable proof. When DNA testing again confirms non-paternity, the courtroom reaches a critical emotional threshold. Judge Lauren Lake explains that while the results answer one question, they raise many others, about identity, responsibility, and the future of the child involved. She makes clear that the court's role ends at truth-finding, not emotional repair. This distinction reflects lessons from the Divorce Course podcast, where legal closure and emotional closure are treated as separate journeys. The description emphasizes that both cases illustrate a shared pattern: adults seeking validation through DNA testing without preparing for its consequences. The phrase DNA test cheating stories becomes more than a keyword. It becomes a cautionary theme. Judge Lauren Lake articulates that DNA does not judge character, but it does expose reality, often faster and more decisively than people expect. Throughout this stage, the judge consistently redirects focus to the children affected. She stresses that children are not evidence, leverage, or tools for revenge. This echoes narratives from adoption stories' full episodes, where courts intervene after biological certainty fails to produce stability. Judge Lauren Lake's approach reinforces that legal systems prioritize the welfare of children even when adults are emotionally fractured. As the courtroom sessions near conclusion for this segment, the description highlights the contrast between expectation and outcome. Parties arrive believing DNA will solve everything, only to realize it solves one question while exposing many unresolved issues. The wife gains clarity but loses trust. The mistress loses certainty but gains truth. The husbands lose credibility and are left facing consequences that no test can erase. This portion of the courtroom story ultimately reinforces a sobering lesson. Justice is not designed to comfort, only to clarify. Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom becomes a space where denial collapses under evidence, and where silence speaks as loudly as testimony. The law does not choose sides, it reveals facts. And once those facts are revealed, every relationship involved must either adapt or dissolve. The description ends this segment by underscoring that DNA testing, while scientific, functions as a mirror. It reflects not just biology but behavior, responsibility, and the cost of deception. In this courtroom, truth does not whisper. It arrives documented, verified, and final, leaving no one untouched by its weight. The final stage of this courtroom description brings all unresolved tension into sharp focus, revealing how legal truth reshapes lives long after the judge delivers the results. Under the authority of Judge Lauren Lake, the courtroom becomes a place where denial finally ends and responsibility begins. What is most striking at this point is not shock, but reckoning. Every person present now understands that once the evidence stage in a divorce case is complete, there is no room left for reinterpretation, excuses, or emotional bargaining. Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that the purpose of the court is not to assign moral superiority, but to establish facts that determine legal outcomes. She explains that DNA testing is one of the most powerful tools in family law because it removes ambiguity entirely. This is why DNA test people regret taking has become such a common phrase, because people often seek confirmation of what they hope is true, not what actually is. In this courtroom, hope has no legal standing. Only verified evidence does. The wife, who entered the courtroom seeking clarity, now faces a complex emotional outcome. Although the DNA results confirm that her husband is not the biological father, the court makes it clear that this does not erase the betrayal that brought them here. Judge Lauren Lake explains that truth can provide answers without providing peace. This distinction reflects discussions frequently raised in the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where certainty often forces individuals to confront realities they were emotionally unprepared to accept. The mistress, now stripped of certainty, becomes a living example of how reliance on assumption can collapse under scientific proof. Judge Lauren Lake addresses her with directness, stating that while belief may feel powerful, it cannot outweigh biology. The courtroom recognizes that while she did not create the deception alone, she must now face the reality that the child's biological father is someone else. This moment underscores why DNA test cheating stories resonate so strongly, because they reveal how quickly confidence turns into consequence. Attention then shifts to the legal implications of prior actions. Judge Lauren Lake explains that signing a birth certificate, claiming benefits, and presenting oneself as a parent all carry legal meaning. Even when DNA disproves paternity, these actions can create complications that courts must untangle. This discussion connects directly to principles similar to adverse inference in Evidence Act, where courts evaluate not just spoken testimony, but conduct. Silence, delay, and contradiction all shape judicial interpretation. The courtroom also revisits the issue of financial responsibility and child support. Judge Lauren Lake clarifies that biological paternity and legal responsibility are not always identical, a concept often misunderstood outside the legal system. She references broader frameworks familiar in Supreme Court child support debates, explaining that courts prioritize the best interest of the child above adult conflict. Even when DNA removes one obligation, it does not automatically resolve all legal consequences. As the proceedings conclude, the judge widens the lens, addressing patterns revealed across both cases heard in the courtroom. She points out that secrecy, infidelity, and avoidance of accountability repeatedly lead individuals into legal crises. This observation aligns closely with themes explored in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where healing only begins after full honesty replaces self-justification. The court, she explains, is not where problems begin, it is where they finally surface. The second case reinforces this message with painful clarity. Here, DNA testing confirms that neither the husband nor his brother is the biological father, leaving the mother confronted with a truth she can no longer redirect. Judge Lauren Lake explains that while the court has resolved the question of paternity, the emotional consequences will persist long after the courtroom empties. This moment reflects lessons emphasized in the Divorce Course podcast, where legal resolution is often just the first step in a much longer personal reckoning. Throughout the final phase, Judge Lauren Lake repeatedly brings attention back to the children involved. She reminds the courtroom that children are not evidence, weapons, or bargaining tools. They are individuals whose lives will be shaped by the decisions made before they could speak. This perspective mirrors narratives found in adoption stories' full episodes, where courts intervene not to punish parents, but to protect futures. The description highlights how the courtroom structure contrasts sharply with the chaos that brought the parties there. Order replaces rumor, evidence replaces accusation, science replaces assumption. Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom demonstrates the concept of justice in jurisprudence by balancing empathy with firmness, allowing emotions to be heard without letting them override facts. This balance reinforces the idea that justice is not cold, but it must be precise. As the final words are delivered, the courtroom atmosphere is no longer explosive, but heavy. The participants understand that while the court has answered the central question, it cannot repair broken trust or rewrite history. The wife must decide what truth means for her marriage. The mistress must determine how to move forward as a single parent. The husbands must confront the long-term consequences of deception. These outcomes illustrate the core lesson repeated across legal education platforms and podcasts alike. Truth does not solve everything, but it stops confusion from growing. Judge Lauren Lake closes by reminding everyone present that the courtroom is not a place of revenge or validation. It is a place of resolution. She reinforces that while emotions may feel justified, only evidence carries authority here. This closing sentiment echoes the central idea behind the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal professionals stress that preparation, honesty, and accountability determine outcomes far more than emotion ever could. The final takeaway from this courtroom description is clear. DNA testing does not destroy families, secrets do. Courts do not create conflict, they expose it. And justice, while sometimes painful, provides the clarity necessary for life to move forward. In this courtroom, the truth does not negotiate. It stands firm, documented and undeniable, leaving each person to face what comes next on their own terms. This is not just a courtroom story. It is a warning, a lesson, and a mirror reflecting the cost of dishonesty. Because once the truth enters the room, everything changes, and nothing can be taken back.